Tonight on Nation to Nation, Crown-Indigenous Relations Minister Gary Anasandagri says recognizing Métis governments in 3 provinces does not include land or harvesting rights.
But for the purpose of this legislation, it does not in any way extend the rights to land or harvesting rights. And I don't know how else I could be clear on this.
Minister of Indigenous Services, Patty Haidu, says a proposed act will guarantee First Nations people access to safe drinking water for generations.
But it also reestablishes or establishes an inherent right to First Nations clean water, which has always been there.
And the NDP's Laurie Idlout says recent progress in Indigenous housing is great, but it is not enough.
Even though it's not enough, it would make a dent in ensuring that Indigenous peoples can be housed no matter where they are in Canada.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau shuffled his cabinet in July, and this included adding a new Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations. Gary Anasandagri replaces Mark Miller, who had held the post for 2 years. He joins me today to talk about his first 6 months on the job and some of the highs and lows. Mr. Anasandagri, thanks very much for joining us today again on Nation to Nation.
Glad to be here.
All right, so let's talk. You've been, I guess, you're coming up about 6 months on the job, and so I'm sure there's been lots of things that have happened in that time. It's a busy portfolio, but what have you, I guess, learned in these first 6 months, and what would you consider your accomplishments or your department's accomplishments?
It's been 5 months, I think, as of December the 26th. It's been a remarkable 5 months. I've had a chance to travel the country, many parts of the country, and meet many communities and many people who are doing great things within the community. And the thing that I really take away as the year closes is, when we look at self-determination as a core value, we see progress. We see enormous strides that are taking place in First Nations communities, in Métis communities, and Inuit. And I think that is the takeaway for me, is that we need to do more of that, and we need to ensure that that First Nations, Métis and Inuit have self-determination over all aspects of their lives. And it is the part of decolonization that I'm inspired by. And along the way there'll be bumps, but what I realize is when we have that as the ultimate goal, we're seeing results, and that is what's exciting. We are a number of tables right now. We're negotiating in British Columbia, for example. We're very close to modern treaties. The first thing that I did formally in my role was the Whitecap modern treaty in Saskatchewan. So I feel as we enter into more modern treaties and as we enter into more self-governing agreements, we see a light that enables Indigenous people to take control over their lives and to have the government play less and less of a role. And that's what that's the takeaway for me, and that's the work that I will continue to do.
I'm going to move to a piece of legislation I'm sure you're familiar with, and that's Bill C-53. It's got a lot of attention. Certainly the First Nations that we talk to are not happy with it, and also the Manitoba Métis Federation, particularly with bringing the Métis Nation Ontario into recognition. So what happens now, or how do you get this legislation back on track?
The legislation is at the committee stage. It's being discussed. There are amendments that are coming through, but I think it's important to we reflect on what this legislation actually does. So in 1982, the Métis were recognized as Aboriginal peoples of Canada in the Constitution Act. Since then, there have been a number of court decisions that have reaffirmed that right and have in fact defined what citizenship is, the parameters of citizenship. So what we're doing with C-53 is recognizing the Métis Nation of Ontario, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan and Alberta as the governments of the Métis in these provinces. As you know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People clearly outlines and calls on Indigenous people to be able to select their own governance structure, and this is what we're doing with this legislation. It does not include harvesting rights, it doesn't include land rights. And I think there are some misconceptions that speak to those rights, and especially in places like Ontario. And I want to be absolutely clear, this legislation does not in any way extend land or harvesting rights. It is very limited to governance.
I'm going to move to another issue, which is, of course, another one I'm sure you're familiar with, and this is a recent kind of report came out, I think, part of the parliamentary budget officers overseeing your department, and that basically the government could be on liabilities of up to $76 billion if they were to go to court, and some of the outstanding land claims, things like that. It's much higher than when the Trudeau government came into power. Is that something that your government wants to work on or avoid, or how do you avoid this number just continuing to grow?
The path to reconciliation requires ensuring that past harms are addressed, and in our system of law, oftentimes it's addressed with financial compensation. So much of the court cases that are pending, and while I think we have 3% of the actual cases, we represent 95% of the contingent liability. Much of the cases that are before the courts are substantive cases that involve past wrongs. For example, hospitals, the failures of in day schools. There are different elements of childhood harms that are still continuing through the system, off-reserved child welfare, for example. So these are there until we resolve them, and to make sure that we compensate. But compensation is a smaller element of the broader things that we need to do, which is healing, which is to make sure that there's self-determination over the lives of Indigenous people. And I think the Parliamentary Budget Chief is highlighting something that I think we've known for a long time, which is the cost to reconciliation. If it's not addressed sooner, it will cost us more.
Okay, well, I knew these were going to be long answers, and I sketched a couple of questions here, but unfortunately we're out of time. But I'll give it just a last opportunity, I suppose, if anything that we can expect in the new year, maybe on child welfare legislation. I know that's not necessarily your portfolio, but I know there's a big, that has to be distributed. Anything?
Look, as we close the year, I mean, we're closing it on a good note. We introduced water legislation through Minister Patty Hajdu, Bill C-61. It's something that was co-developed, has been working with First Nations people for many, many years, and I think it is something that is long overdue, so we're very excited about that. We just announced the Urban-Rural Northern funding, which ensures there's distinctions-based funding towards urban, rural, and northern communities. I think that's a game changer. $4 billion in investments that includes an Indigenous-led model for Indigenous by Indigenous model, as well as distinctions-based. So we're very, as we close the year, I'm very optimistic that we're on the right path. We're continuing the investments. We're trying to close the gaps. At the same time, we're looking at the long term to ensure that we have true reconciliation by ensuring there's self-determination over all aspects of the lives of Indigenous people. So I'm very grateful to be in this role, and I'm humbled to have met so many people across the country, and I look forward to working with Indigenous people, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in the new year.
Well, of course, we'll have to leave it there for time, but once again, Minister Anasangri, we really appreciate you coming into the studio, and best of the holidays to you as well.
Likewise, and thank you for this opportunity. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Up next, we'll have Minister of Indigenous Services Patty Hajdu to talk about the government's new First Nations water legislation. You're watching Nation and Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. It was a busy fall for the Trudeau government with a number of initiatives targeted towards Indigenous people. This included the introduction of the First Nations Clean Water Act, which Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu says will guarantee First Nations people have safe drinking water for generations. Minister Hajdu joins me now. So, Minister Hajdu, welcome back to Nation and Nation.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So one thing I know that you'd like to talk about, and it's the most recently sort of thing that, or one of them that came through your department, and that's the First Nations Clean Water Act. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about what this piece of legislation will do?
Well, this is really exciting legislation that will protect water for First Nations for generations to come. Primarily, what it does is it protects, first of all, the water that feeds First Nations. It gives tools to First Nations for ongoing equality to access to fresh water and the tools they need to keep that water clean. But it also reestablishes or establishes an inherent right to First Nations clean water, which has always been there. But in fact, successive governments have undermined or deeply affected as a result of decisions made by local, provincial, and federal governments. And so this legislation was worked on extensively with First Nations people, and it was a real moment of honor for me to be able to table that legislation with First Nations partners standing beside last week in the House of Commons.
Okay, and I know that at the press conference, and there was a lot of support from different First Nations organizations, but we did interview the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, Chief Bobby Cameron. They're against it for a few reasons. One being that it doesn't include maintenance agreements, and also not enough protection, I think, for source water, and there's still these outstanding long-term water advisories. Is there? I guess you can answer both, like maybe some of the FSAN's concerns, but also is the government at a point where it kind of is able to see maybe when there will be no long-term water advisories in place?
I will say that this is a good news story, and I would respond to the FSIN by saying that we are interested in hearing feedback on the bill. This will be a collaborative process through the House. The concern around ongoing funding is actually addressed in the legislation. The legislation commits to equitable funding for First Nations water sources compared to that of non-First Nations similar communities, and so that equity perspective was built in with the guidance of First Nations partners who helped to draft that legislation.
All right, and I just want to move to another big piece of news last week was the announcement of this Indigenous Housing Center that they're gonna take, I guess, tenders for that. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's going to work and what it will do?
Absolutely. Well, again, since we took office, in funding for First Nations housing on First Nation has increased by 1,100%. Over 33,000 units of housing has been repaired or built in the past 8 years. We know there's still a big gap on First Nations. That's why we've made commitments as recently as Budget 2022 for $4 billion towards First Nations housing. So that money continues to roll out. But what we've also heard is that many First Nations, about 80% actually of First Nations residents, actually don't live in their home community, live in urban, rural, and northern settings. And sometimes people are disconnected from their home community as well. So in recent budgets, the government committed an additional $4 billion towards housing for First Nations people, First Nations Indigenous people, actually out of sight of their home communities. And so what we have always known is that actually um, programs that are designed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people deliver better results by far.
All right, now I'm going to move to something I know that you've been asked about a number of times, not necessarily by us, but by CBC and some other media outlets about this sort of $15 billion across government budget cuts and how that will affect ISC. I know it comes at a time when some of the programming like child welfare settlement, that's already been budgeted, and also some programs are sunsetting. So there's a lot of things going on. But is this going to affect the services of Indigenous people that depend on ISC for certain services?
The short answer is no. It won't. And in fact, if you look at the letter that the Treasury Board president wrote to all departments, she was explicit that any service, any considerations on reductions to overall budgets of departments could not affect first of all, direct delivery of programs and services to Indigenous peoples. It certainly could not affect direct transfers to other orders of government, including First Nations government. And so that positioned our department in a place where we could feel confident saying that we would be able to present to Treasury Board a plan that would not actually in any way undermine the program services and direct transfers to First Nations. This is really important to our government that we continue to invest in closing the gap, certainly not contribute to any growing gap that exists.
Okay, and as a last question here, Cindy Woodhouse, was elected as the APTN National Chief, I guess about a couple weeks ago. Have you had a chance to talk to her yet, and what did you talk about?
I have. I've talked to her a couple times already. First of all, I just congratulated her on a very important win for her and certainly for APTN. And I told her that I was looking forward to her leadership. I was looking forward to having a strong APTN partner. We have many joint pieces of work ahead of us, including the water legislation. And APTN was a powerful contributor to how that legislation looked. We were able to use expert committee of APTN to help us ensure that the water legislation met the mark. But there are many other challenges ahead, and I'm looking forward to having a strong APTN partner to address them, and Indigenous partners who are designing how best to deliver that money to people. And so that is no longer in the hands or purview of the federal government, but we still have a lot of work to do on the second half of that child welfare piece of work, which is to ensure that we have a strong child welfare system going forward. As you know, there's another $20 billion set aside to make sure that the system is truly reformed. And I'm looking forward to National Chief's perspective on how best to get that job done.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. But as always, a pleasure, Minister Hajdu, and have a safe and happy holiday season.
Thank you very much, Fraser. Take care.
You too. After the break, we'll talk to the NDP's Lori Idloud about some of the Liberals' recent Indigenous housing initiatives. You're watching Nation and Nation, and I'm Fraser Needham. In this year's budget, the Liberals put $4 billion over 7 years to address the housing needs of Indigenous people living away from their home communities. The NDP's Lori Idloud says this is a good start, but not nearly enough. She joins me today in the Ottawa studio. All right, Lori, so thanks once again for joining us on Nation and Nation today.
For inviting me, Fraser.
So I guess we'll start with earlier this month, the announcement of the Indigenous Housing Centre, of course, that you were part of. And I know the NDP is happy that this is actually moving finally, and it's going to be made by for Indigenous people sort of process. But still, we only have this $8.5 billion for all Indigenous housing needs across this country. I know that you've brought up issues in the north, particularly Nunavut. Is that amount of money for everyone across the country? Is that even going to make a dent in areas like Nunavut?
So for the $4 billion over 7 years, when we negotiated that through the supply and confidence agreement, we made it clear from the beginning that it wasn't enough. We had actually asked for more, and we ended up settling with $4 billion over 7 years in the 11th hour. So knowing that it could make a dent is why we agreed to it. I know that with this fund, it'll be focused on urban, rural, northern communities. I know that, for example, if we're able to get Ottawa Indigenous communities to apply to it, and it ended up funding homes for people in Ottawa, Indigenous peoples in Ottawa, it would make a huge difference, because I've been hearing from the Inuit community here in Ottawa that there's been a few deaths because of overdose and people being homeless in the streets. So I think that even though it's not enough, it would make a dent in ensuring that Indigenous peoples can be housed no matter where they are in Canada.
Yes, maybe we'll move to Bill C-53 as well, too, because we've been following that. And of course, there's been a lot in Ontario in particular feedback and unhappiness, largely with the Métis Nation of Ontario being included in the legislation. They are a controversial organization, let's face it. And regardless of what the government said, I don't think they maybe did enough homework on this bill. Now it's sort of what we get. The answer from the government is, okay, well, the groups themselves now need to work it out amongst themselves after we've drafted the legislation. But from the NDP's point of view, what could the government do to save this piece of legislation maybe, or make it better? Because I think it's in real danger now from what we're seeing.
The federal government could be more clear to say that indeed this does not impact lands, territories, and resources, because that's what First Nations in Ontario are concerned about. And if both the Métis Nation of Ontario and the federal government are saying that it will not impact First Nations lands, territories, and resources, then include that kind of wording in the bill.
And maybe as my last question, I'll ask you now about something that's been going on. Obviously, we're heading into a little bit more austerity times. There's less money. Liberals are carrying quite a large debt now. There's cost cutting. Now, they have continued to say, of course, this is not going to affect Indigenous Services, and even though there are cuts there, and I know there was quite a heated debate on this in the House recently. What's your thoughts? Some of these programs are being sunsetted. Are Indigenous people really going to be, unfortunately, maybe shortchanged by the government coming up in the next few budgets because of just lack of money?
If the $7.6 billion in programs that are sunsetting will not be renewed, then Indigenous peoples will continue to be marginalized. That's why I'm so thankful to the NDP who have fought hard for Indigenous peoples, and we were able to get the Take Note debate. We got the consent of all MPs to highlight, to signal to the federal government that the importance of Indigenous peoples, respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, not making further cuts to make sure that Indigenous peoples can be uplifted is so important. For generations, Indigenous peoples, funding or investments to serve Indigenous peoples have always been too low. The chronic underinvestments have led to what we see in our social indicators. We know, for example, that there are whenever there are reports of homelessness, too many of them are either First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. When there are reports of health indicators, just for example, the Chief Public Health Officer in Nunavut recently announced that 5 people had died by tuberculosis in the last 2 years. So a lot of these underinvestments are seeping out into our health and social indicators, and we need to put a stop to that. We need to show true commitment to Indigenous peoples and reconciliation by giving them the investments that they need, regardless of what is going on in Canada's economy, because that can't be used as a justification to not invest in Indigenous peoples.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but as always, thanks for joining us on Nation to Nation, and have a nice holiday.
Thank you so much, Fraser. Happy holidays to everyone as well.
Thank you. That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. There's also the last episode of Nation to Nation for 2023. I want to thank you for joining us throughout the year and wish you a safe and happy holiday season. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night, and see you in 2024.